Okay, and welcome to World History with Mr. Gaspar. Today we're going to be talking about the Renaissance. It sounds French, but it's actually Italian. Go figure. What we're going to do today is we're going to go over each of the questions that appear in Edgenuity. I'm going to walk you through them, give you the answers in advance, as well as some context and some extra information that Edgenuity mysteriously left out. Okay, let's get to it. So the Renaissance, when did it happen? About 1330-ish to 1600s in a place called Europe. You may have heard of this. French favorite place for the French and their baguettes. So Europe is where we're going to be zeroing in on, specifically a place called Italy. It's where the Super Mario Brothers are from. So let's look at some time, because basically Edgenuity just jumps right into talking about the Renaissance and leaves out about 99% of world history. It's not really a world history class. In fact, about 90% of the content focuses on Europe. I can't imagine why. So here's some things that kind of got left out, okay, of Edgenuity. A whole host of civilizations dating back to, basically 10,000 years ago, okay? Well, 5,000 years ago, the first start of civilizations, just completely gone, omitted from the course. There's no mention of really African civilizations, Chinese civilizations, civilizations that occurred in Latin America. Most of the class is focusing on Europe, and you can see that by basically how it jumps in, leaving all of this stuff out, okay? So in case you've heard about Rome or classical Greece or Mesopotamia or anything like that, it's not mentioned in this course, unfortunately, okay? But just to give you a little bit of context, here's where we're jumping in at right here. We're jumping in at a place called the post-classical age, which is after many of these civilizations have already tanked. And again, we're focusing in on Europe, specifically in Italy, okay? Here is the world. Here is the United States of America. There is Washington right there. Let's zoom in case you didn't know where Italy is. It's this little boot right there. I will boot that. And here is Europe, okay? Which is basically, Renaissance starts in Italy and then as a culture kind of diffuses throughout Europe. Very influential. That's what we're talking about, okay? Here's another picture of it. These little lines here are places where Europeans were trading. This is going to be important in just a second, because all of these little lines are one of the reasons why the Renaissance actually started here in Italy first. Okay, it's the location. It's very central to trade. Okay, so let's go into the quiz questions. This is literally one of the quiz questions that you could get on Edgenuity. The Renaissance began in Italy. Pretty simple. They covered that, okay? Why did it begin in Italy? We'll talk about it in a second. Renaissance basically means rebirth, okay? And another quiz question that you can see, it's right there. The Renaissance is best described as rebirth. What does that mean? Well, if you looked at that timeline that I just gave you, you'd notice that there was a lot of stuff that doesn't get covered in the course. And if you were to look at Europe prior to the Renaissance and really during the Renaissance, Europe is absolutely backwards. It's one of the lowest civilizations on the planet, okay? If you were to compare Europe to, let's say, the Islamic empires at the time or the Chinese empires at the time, Europe is absolutely the laggards, okay? And things were even worse before the Renaissance, okay? If you were to go to Europe in the Middle Ages, essentially most Europeans were, hunting pigs with sticks. Things were ugly and bad. Whereas in, let's say, the Islamic world or China, culture was very vibrant. They had amazing and technologically advanced civilizations, okay? That starts to change for Europe during the Renaissance, all right? That's why it's called the Rebirth, because things start looking up for Europeans as they begin to sort of interact more with the world, traveling to some of these more advanced cultures and places, picking up on these ideas, and it's a rebirth, okay? European civilization starts to flourish for the first time in a long time. Okay, things had really started to break down since the Roman Empire fell at the end of the classical age, okay? So the Renaissance led to major artistic, social, and political changes in Europe. That's another potential question that you could get, okay? And some of those artistic changes you can see very clearly right here with this picture of the Mona Lisa. One of the things that is interesting about the Renaissance is that art starts to become much, much, much more realistic. The sculptures become very realistic. The artists themselves are become much more talented, okay, as compared to some of the artistic styles that you see in medieval Europe. I'll show you some pictures of that in just a second here, okay? The Renaissance began in northern Italy because northern Italy was close to a lot of ancient civilizations, like a place called Byzantium. Byzantium is what was left of the Roman Empire. It was close to and partially conquered to some extent by some of the Islamic empires to the south, which had spread across North Africa during this time. And so because of where northern Italy was, it was interacting with these places. You actually had some trade even to China. If you've ever heard of a guy, the game Marco Polo, that was a real dude who actually went from Italy all the way to China, and it's not just, the tasty foods that he brought back, but also some ideas, okay? And so that's kind of one of the things that began to spark the Renaissance, is that people are trading, these Italians are trading, and they're coming into contact with different people, and they're bringing back ideas. Okay, so art, right? This would be an example of art in the Middle Ages. It's not really that great. It kind of looks like maybe, maybe your fourth grade friend that liked to color all the time and not pay attention in lessons. So it's not, obviously not as good as, say, the Mona Lisa, which we just looked at a second. Very realistic, right? That's a key difference with Renaissance. You'll also notice things are looking a little rough, right, for the Europeans during the Middle Ages. This dude's getting his head cut off, and I don't know what, this guy's getting cut in half. It's pretty brutal stuff. Like I said, it's the rebirth because, there's still wars and things like that, but civilization is looking up for the Europeans during this time, after a long lapse. Again, you look at some of these early artistic styles in medieval Europe before the Renaissance, and, again, lots of violence, lots of fighting, not really that realistic per se. It's kind of like a 2D drawing or something. You got, what do we got? Oh, you got this rabbit cutting this dude's head off. Apparently that was huge in the Middle Ages, rabbits cutting people's heads off. Okay, and here's some rabbits mugging a guy, apparently. This took place on 96th and Hosmer, would be my guess. Yeah, okay. Again, not very artistic, but there you go. Okay, so again, this is another quiz question. So Italy's location on the Mediterranean Sea, right? That's this place down here, right? It contributed to the flourishing of the Renaissance because Italy's location allowed many travelers and traders to bring back new ideas. Again, that's a possible quiz question that you could get right here. Okay, and basically, because Italy's right here, it can take some boats down and trade over here and reach, a lot of Middle Eastern civilizations, the Islamic empires that are down here that are very technologically advanced at this point in time. North Africa, also part of Islamic empires that are spreading all over the place. You could, Constantinople, which early on was part of the Byzantine Empire, what was left of Rome. And there's this thing called the Silk Road that they could tap into that would go all the way to China. And you did have a couple of towns that were able to do that, again, like Marco Polo, okay? So as they're trading with these people, they're not just bringing back goods, they're bringing back new ideas. Okay. And that's going to help Europeans really kind of come out of the Dark Ages. Okay, so another thing that helped Italy, and here's another quiz question, is that if you were to compare Italy to the rest of Europe, particularly northern Italy, it had a lot more cities. A lot of Europe during this time is rural, it's primarily farming, and they're not as interested in trading as much as Italy is, okay? In fact, you have kind of the early formations of capitalism, which is kind of driving some of this trade. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so during the Renaissance, Italian cities became centers of banking and finance. Those banks are giving out loans to merchants, which are going to allow them to buy ships on credit. Oftentimes, they could finance these journeys and go to these different places, and again, bring back the stuff to Italy that's going to help Italy come out of the Dark Ages, and take back some of these ideas and these new learnings that gets Europe going again after it had been in a slump for a very long time. I'm getting lots of messages. Here's a naked person for you. Awesome. Okay. So during the Renaissance, more Europeans became increasingly interested in education and the arts, probably because they were rich. If you get all those banks and all that trade going on, you've got more spare time, and so you could focus on you, improving yourself. That would be wealthy people that could do that. If you were a peasant, you would still be living in mud and getting killed. Okay. So at the beginning of the Renaissance, the Italian city of Rome, still around, included many elements of taken from Greek art and architecture. In fact, the Renaissance as a movement borrowed a lot from Greek art and architecture. So this sculpture right here, David, obviously very realistic looking, right? And a naked guy, the Greeks like that. You would see realistic sculptures like that in ancient Rome. And then when ancient Rome collapsed, that really died out. And you see a revival of this or rebirth of this during the Renaissance as these artists turned back and looked at what the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans were able to do and said, you know what, we can do that too. And so as a result, you have this flourishing of art and ideas that starts to take place and these very amazing lifelike sculptures that are created at this time. Okay, so Renaissance art was strongly influenced by ancient Greek and Roman architecture, okay? And again, that's a possible quiz question. All of these are quiz questions that you could see on Edgenuity. Let's look at some of this architecture, okay? The Arco Foscari in the courtyard of the Doge Palace, late 1450s. Excuse me, you could tell that this is influenced by like Greek or Roman architecture by a lot of the columns that you see in this place. Okay, you would see that in, ancient Greek and Roman buildings as well. This is a little more ornate. That's how you can kind of tell it's Renaissance, but there you go. There's the Doge Palace, and there is the Doge, in case you were wondering. He's right there. There we go. That was his palace. Okay, so wealthy men, again, they're trading. You got these bankers, they're making tons of money. They're going all over the place. They change their interest during the Renaissance. They start focusing on educational goals. It has to do with this movement called Humanism we're going to talk about in a second. New skills to become well-rounded. Again, they got lots of money and time. They can do that. In medieval Europe, your life expectancy, if you lived to 30, that's a good thing. So you didn't have a lot of time to focus on education. As conditions begin to improve during the Renaissance, you could focus on these things. So during the Renaissance, Italian artists were supported by wealthy patrons. Have you heard of the website Patreon? That's where it gets its name from. So basically, like this guy, Michelangelo, one of the famous Renaissance painters and sculptors, he was supported. He was able to do his art because basically these wealthy Renaissance people, patrons, were able to just give him money and say, hey, paint for me, build this for me, make this sculpture, and make it naked, apparently. So wealthy residents bought works of art, which supported the artists, and again, that allowed the Renaissance to really flourish and take off. So you can see like some of this wealth coming in. Here's the famous Renaissance painters, by the way, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello. Splinter is not in here. Okay, so one prominent merchant family in Italy during the Renaissance was the Medicis. They were related to the Super Mario Brothers, actually. Here's one of them who was the founder of the Medici Bank. Looks like a really fun guy. Oh, no, go back. Okay, that's Wario Medici, founder of the Medici card dynasty. I can't go back. I'm not sure what that's about. But basically the Medicis, what the previous question said is, well, a couple of things. They had a ton of money and, they supported people. Medici himself was like, a lot of the Medicis rose to government positions, ruled some of these city-states. Basically they were able to convince people in the Catholic Church to support arts and artistry too, in part because they were very prominent members of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church during this time period, unfortunately, there's pretty severe corruption. Like literally, if you wanted to be Pope, you could buy that position. And the Medicis kind of engaged in that. The positive thing is that they were able to get the Catholic Church to start supporting some amazing architecture, Sistine Chapel, things like that. Okay, so Medicis were able to convince Catholic Church to become patrons of the arts because they became church leaders and pushed the church to support the arts. Okay, the Medicis also made city-states. Their city-state of Florence. Florence was basically a city that was its own country, And they made beautiful palaces and libraries during that time. Again, they had tons of money. And this would be an example of one of the Medici's palaces that they had built. So very extravagant stuff. Again, these are both quiz questions that you could see. Okay, so yeah, wealthy merchants like Cosimo de' Medici, he ruled Italian city-states. Some of these guys, again, they were so rich that they could basically just, buy positions in government, and they became very powerful. So as leader of Florence, that city-state, that city that was basically its own country, this guy, Cosimo Medici, he would be characterized as a patron, somebody who would support arts and artistry and things like that. Merchant families that ruled Italian city-states established their own armies. So in other words, like some of these guys were so wealthy, these bankers and these financiers, these merchants, they had so much money that they would actually like build literally their own armies. So it would be like today if like Walmart hired a bunch of Navy SEALs or something like that. Italy at this point in time had a very kind of chaotic government. It was not one big country. It was a bunch of small little city-states, cities that were basically their own countries. The Renaissance affected independent monarchs by increasing their power. What that means is that before the Renaissance, the Pope was incredibly powerful in Europe, oftentimes, and could kind of influence kings to kind of do the bidding of the Pope, and that definitely begins to change during the Renaissance and after the Renaissance, particularly in these Italian city-states, as these very wealthy little city-states gained tremendous amounts of power, and the influence of the Pope began to decline for reasons that we'll talk about later. All right, women, by the way, had very little political or economic power during this time period. That was also true during the Classical Age and earlier. In fact, prior to this, the only time that women would have had power or influence would have been during the Paleolithic Age. And it's not until, later, until the rise of movements like, modern day liberalism that we'll talk about, that you start to see women gaining political and economic power. In China, actually, that's not true. There was one empress we're going to talk about, a couple of empresses, actually. Okay. All right. A significant concept that influenced Renaissance artists, many philosophers and political leaders, is something called humanism, okay? It's hard to describe what humanism is because it changed over its time period. But basically, in a nutshell, it kind of relates back to that idea that I was talking about earlier, that wealthy men in the Renaissance tried to better themselves through education. That's kind of the idea of humanism, right? That, in a nutshell, that human beings should devote themselves to learning, particularly going back to the classics that the Greeks and the Romans wrote about, things like that. And humanism impacted political thinking during the Renaissance by reducing the importance of religion over how people thought about society. That's another thing that you could say was associated with humanism. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Pope starts to really lose his power during this time period. And people began to question religion. We'll talk about this guy, Martin Luther, in a little bit, who was definitely, influenced during this time period and basically split Christianity in half, a second time. There'd been an earlier split that Edgenuity doesn't talk about between, Eastern Orthodox and, modern Catholicism, which I don't think is covered in Edgenuity. So during the Renaissance, people began to question religious ideas, traditional religious teachings. Science slowly but surely starts to make a comeback as Europeans start traveling around the world and interacting with different cultures and learning new things that sort of change their perspective. Okay, and that is it. That's all I've got. I'll put that slide that I missed earlier at the end. I'll just cut and paste it in so you could take a look at that. If you have any questions, you can email me at bgaspe@tacoma.k12.wa.us. Obviously, you're going to have a link to this on my Teams page, and we will see you next time.